They spent hundreds of millions of pounds fixing up a palace that no one was ever going to live in. And the woman who was once the most hated person in Britain, the one the public blamed for breaking up a fairy tale marriage, now found herself at the center of yet another royal storm. Not because she had done anything wrong this time, but because the palace, the press, and the people of Britain were watching every move she made, waiting for a crack. This is the story of King Charles, Queen Camilla, Clarence House, and a decision that quietly shook the British monarchy to its foundation. For nearly 200 years, there was one simple rule at the heart of the British monarchy. The king or queen lived in Buckingham Palace. It was not just a rule, it was a tradition so old and so deeply rooted that it had become part of what the monarchy meant. Since Queen Victoria moved in back in 1837, every single sovereign had called that enormous, iconic building at the end of the mall their home. The palace had become more than bricks and stone. It was a symbol. It was the face of the crown. When people stood outside the gates and looked up at that famous balcony, they were not just looking at a building. They were looking at the idea of Britain itself. So when King Charles III quietly announced in the summer of 2026 that he would not be moving into Buckingham Palace, not now, not ever, the reaction across Britain was swift and sharp. For many people, the news landed like a sudden jolt. Here was a monarch who had spent his entire adult life preparing for the throne, a man who had waited longer than any heir in British history, and now that the crown was finally on his head, he was choosing to stay in Clarence House, the relatively modest royal residence just a short walk away, while Buckingham Palace stood largely empty after a renovation that had cost the British public an eye-watering £369 million. The numbers alone were enough to make people uncomfortable. £369 million. That is the kind of figure that makes headlines for weeks. It is the kind of sum that, in a country still wrestling with a bruising cost-of-living crisis, still feeling the aftershocks of years of economic strain, lands with enormous weight. Every pound of that money had come from public funding, the sovereign grant, a system by which a portion of profits from the crown estate flows into the royal household to cover official expenses and maintenance of royal properties. The British public had been told the renovation was necessary, that the old electrical wiring was dangerous, that the building needed serious structural work, and the public had largely accepted that. But they had accepted it on the understanding that once the work was done, the king and queen would move in. That had always been the plan. Now the plan had changed, and no one had really asked the public what they thought about it. The official announcement came through the release of the annual Sovereign Grant Report, the document that lays out the financial workings of the royal household for the previous year. James Chalmers, the keeper of the Privy Purse and the official responsible for royal finances, confirmed the decision without a great deal of fanfare. King Charles and Queen Camilla would remain at Clarence House as their primary London residence. Buckingham Palace, once the renovation was complete in 2027, would function as what officials called an operational headquarters for the monarchy, a place for official events, state functions, and meetings, but not a home. The king would have access to private rooms in the palace for daytime use or occasional overnight stays, but his permanent London address would remain Clarence House. There was a careful explanation attached to all of this. Royal officials pointed to the benefits for the public. With the king and queen not residing in the palace full-time, there could be significantly more public access to the state rooms and the historic spaces inside. From July through September 2026, the public would be able to book tickets to visit. The palace would, in theory, become more open than it had ever been. Officials framed this as a generous and forward-thinking move, a sign that the monarchy understood it needed to connect with ordinary people, to justify its existence and its cost in a modern age. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams acknowledged that the decision represented what he called a significant step for the family. But he was also candid about the complications. The optics, he noted, were likely to raise eyebrows. And that was the thing, it was the optics that were doing the most damage. People were not necessarily opposed to the idea of the king living somewhere other than Buckingham Palace. What they struggled with was the feeling that they had paid an enormous amount of money for a renovation of a building that the king had apparently already decided he did not want to live in. That raised uncomfortable questions about transparency, about planning, about whether the public had been misled, even if unintentionally, about the original purpose of all that spending. And at the center of all of this, as she so often found herself, was Queen Camilla. Camilla had lived at Clarence house since 2003, first as Charles's partner, then as his wife after their marriage in April 2005, and then as queen consort following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, and now as queen. The house had been her home for over 2 decades. It was where she had built her life alongside Charles. It was familiar, manageable, and deeply personal to both of them. There was also the matter of Ray Mill House, Camilla's privately owned home in Wiltshire, which she had kept through all the years of her relationship with Charles. A former royal gardener who had worked at Charles's country home, Highgrove, for more than 2 decades, confirmed that the couple had agreed before their marriage that Camilla would hold onto Ray Mill House as her own space, somewhere she could go with her children and grandchildren, somewhere away from the scrutiny of royal life, somewhere that felt purely her own. That arrangement had worked well for both of them over the years, giving each some personal breathing room even as they shared a public life together. But the question that royal watchers and the press kept circling back to was a thornier one. What exactly did Camilla's position look like now, in the shifting landscape of a monarchy under financial and public scrutiny? The Buckingham Palace decision had put a spotlight not just on Charles, but on the entire structure of how the royal family lived, spent, and justified itself to the people it served. And Camilla, as queen, was inevitably part of that conversation. The issue of royal privileges, who got them, who kept them, who lost them, had already been front and center in recent years. The decision to strip Prince Andrew of his royal titles and official privileges had been one of the most significant moments of the early Charles reign. It had been a family decision, sources confirmed, involving not just Charles and William but reportedly Camilla and Catherine, Princess of Wales, as well. Royal courtiers told the press that Camilla, in particular, had a keen sense of where public opinion stood. She had spent years rebuilding her own reputation with the British public, understanding better than most that the monarchy survived on trust, and that trust could evaporate quickly when the institution seemed out of touch or unwilling to hold its own members to account. Now Camilla found herself in a strange position. She was queen. She was living in the house she had always lived in, and yet the decision to stay in Clarence House rather than move to Buckingham Palace had opened up fresh debates about what her role actually entailed, what privileges came with that role, and whether the public felt the value was there. The sovereign grant figures painted a complicated picture. The grant had risen significantly in recent years, driven largely by the Buckingham Palace renovation costs and boosted by record profits from Crown Estate offshore wind farms. For 2026 to 2027, the grant was set at £137.9 million, a substantial sum that reflected the scale of palace maintenance, royal cybersecurity investment, and energy-efficient heating systems being installed across occupied royal residences. The following year it was due to drop back to roughly £100 million. Charles himself had taken an unusual step in this financial climate. He became the first British monarch to publicly disclose the amount of personal tax he had paid. The figures showed he had paid £12.9 million in income tax in 2024 to 2025, with his private income coming largely from the Duchy of Lancaster, which was expected to generate £25.2 million in 2025 to 2026. This kind of transparency was unprecedented. It was clearly a deliberate move to show that the king was not hiding behind royal tradition when it came to his finances, that he understood the modern expectation of accountability and was willing to meet it. But transparency in figures did not automatically translate into public satisfaction. The British press, and through it the British public, continued to push and probe at the edges of what the royal family received, how it was justified, and whether those at the top were genuinely cutting their cloth to match the times or merely performing austerity while the bills kept rising. William, meanwhile, had made his own notable financial gesture, giving up €1.8 million in annual rental income from the former Dartmoor prison estate, redirecting those funds to the development of the rural Princetown community. It was the kind of move that played well publicly, a visible act of financial sacrifice with a clear community benefit attached to it. For Camilla, the scrutiny had a particular edge to it. She had never had an easy relationship with British public opinion. The years following Princess Diana's death had been difficult beyond measure. The weight of public blame, the anger, the constant comparisons, she had lived through all of it, and she had survived it. By the time Charles became king, polling showed that attitudes toward Camilla had softened considerably. Many people had come to respect her quiet dedication to her public duties, her work with literacy and domestic violence charities, and her steady presence beside Charles during his cancer diagnosis and treatment in 2024. She had shown, in the eyes of many observers, that she could handle the role with grace and seriousness. But the past never entirely disappeared. There were always those who remained resistant to her, who felt that her position as queen was something that should never have been. And in moments of royal controversy, like the Buckingham Palace decision, old resentments had a way of surfacing again, finding new fuel in fresh grievances. The question of what Camilla gained from her position, what she was entitled to, what the public was effectively paying for, would not go away simply because she had earned some goodwill over the preceding years. What made all of this particularly complex was the nature of the decision itself. This was not a dramatic stripping of titles or a public falling out. There was no scandal in the conventional sense. There was simply a very large and very expensive building that a very powerful man had decided he did not want to live in. And wrapped around that central fact were all the usual forces of royal politics, questions of tradition versus modernity, public cost versus private preference, the expectations the British people carried about their monarchy versus the reality of how that monarchy actually chose to operate day to day. Charles, by all accounts, had a deep affection for Buckingham Palace. Palace officials were careful to communicate this. He respected its history, its symbolic importance, its place in the imagination of people across Britain and around the world. The balcony from which monarchs had waved at crowds after coronations and jubilees and the end of wars was not going anywhere. Major royal occasions would still unfold there. The palace would remain what one commentator called Monarchy HQ, the operational and ceremonial heart of the institution, even if it was no longer a home. But Clarence House was where Charles and Camilla had their lives. It was where they had their routines, their staff arrangements built over decades, their familiar rhythms. Moving to Buckingham Palace for a 77-year-old king managing a cancer recovery and a demanding public schedule was a disruption that, in his judgment and the judgment of those closest to him, simply was not necessary or warranted. The decision made practical sense, even if the optics were uncomfortable. For Camilla, 78 years old, and having spent more than 2 decades carving out her place in the royal family, Clarence House represented something more than just a convenient address. It was the house where she had finally, after so many years of uncertainty and public hostility, built a stable and recognized royal life. And whatever storms blew through the pages of the British press, whatever questions were asked about finances and privileges, and the cost of keeping a monarchy afloat in an era of economic hardship, she remained there, in the house she knew, beside the king she had loved for decades, navigating a world that had never quite stopped watching her with complicated eyes. Palace announcement did not end the conversation. If anything, it opened new ones. Questions about public access, about long-term royal finances, about whether the monarchy was evolving fast enough or not fast enough. All of these remained very much alive. What the story of Clarence House in the summer of 2026 ultimately illustrated was something that had always been true about the British royal family, something that had certainly been true for Camilla throughout her life in the public eye. Nothing was ever quite settled. Every decision, however practical, however carefully explained, carried the weight of history behind it and the pressure of public judgment ahead. The rooms at Clarence House were familiar, but the questions waiting outside its gates never really went away.